This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. This evening I am talking to Sean, who I met on the Kiwi RPG Discord and who very kindly volunteered to be part of my mini-series of talking to people from Kiwi RPG, to plug the fact that you should go check out Kiwi RPG Week. Go find out more about that at kiwirpg.com. But good evening, Sean. How's it going?
It's good. You know, just another day.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm very pleased to have you on the show. And this is a game that on checking out, I realized that maybe someone had shown me a paper copy of it at some point. And then I'd completely forgotten its existence. But I'm looking forward to talking about it with you because I think if people listen to last week's episode about Deadlands is a fascinating microcosm of a lot of 90s role-playing trends. And I think this game kind of is in its own way as well. We're talking about a thing called Violence, the RPG of egregious and repulsive bloodshed, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, although it is to some degree a joke as well. But what made you want to talk about this thing?
I think it's sits in a really interesting spot in the history of the hobby, because you're talking about how Deadlands is kind of a microcosm of 90s design trends, right?
Yeah.
Violence kind of, to me, seems like a reaction to that, and a kind of scathing one at that. So it's quite cool. Just a really interesting kind of game or text. I don't know. We'll get into that. I don't know if it's actually meant to be played.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a mess.
No, look, I think that's a good place to start, actually, because Violence comes from this outfit called Hogshead Games. And Hogshead made, when I looked into them, a whole bunch of stuff that I actually remember people owning and having good times with, or at least interesting times with, throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. So things like Puppet Land, The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen. I think they're tied up with a thing called Nobilis as well, which is a role-playing game about being something similar to Neil Gaiman's concept of the endless. The personification of something like death or dreaming or something like that. And all of these are quite high-minded and experimental things, but they also released this thing, which says on the cover, not recommended for readers under the age of 18. Actually, we're not sure it's recommended for anyone. Then goes on to, in text, berate you for reading the book, and deliberately complain. It's got a narrator's voice who constantly complains about having to write the game.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's written by Greg Kostakian, who is this, I think, pretty prolific designer. He worked on all sorts of things. And if you look at his work, a lot of it is very genre pushing, very experimental. He worked on Toon and Paranoia, and kind of all sorts of weird games that pushed a lot of boundaries, but his name isn't even on it. He's ashamed to be even associated with this thing. He's got a pseudonym. Yeah,
he calls himself Designer X, and And like, if you look at the text, so he's actually released the game as like a copyright free thing, so anyone can just download a PDF copy of it if they really want to. And if you look at that, you'll find that he's done it as though like his name has been stickered over in order to remove it.
Yeah, it's just kind of like an ongoing bit. It's really funny. I mean, if you were kind of following this guy as a fan after playing Toon or something, I mean, you'd probably be in for a bit of a shock, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like Toon is another thing that I'd completely forgotten was tied up with Hogshead. Yeah, Toon is like fascinating comparison because it's like a very like wacky but in a much more innocent way role-playing game that's trying to like give you like the Looney Tunes experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do a whole like thing in itself on Toon. It's such like it's a really weird game for its time, and it's also got if I'm remembering right, I think Warren Spector worked on it, who did was the lead designer on Deus Ex, which is like a weird little connection there.
Yeah, I mean, there is like that odd connection, particularly in the British games scene at this point in time, because Hogshead is a British company. Because Hogshead, like I did a little bit of research as well as reading the game, and Hogshead got their start like publishing Warhammer stuff or Warhammer adjacent stuff, and then kind of split off and became their own thing.
Yeah.
So there are all of these like very, very short chains of connection, I guess, because Britain is not very big.
Yeah, there's just all sorts of crossovers from that time. You kind of get the sense that all these folks were like in very close proximity and kind of bouncing stuff off each other. Like if I'm remembering correctly, I think a lot of the Doom guys were very involved with tabletop games as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There is a very like teenagers playing their first games of Dungeons and Dragons thing with Doom. I could definitely like the Dungeons and Dragons 80s heavy metal Venn diagram. Like I can see how that leads the output of that to be Doom.
It's like a circle.
Yeah. The thing about violence, which I think is because we've talked about like how it's this kind of reaction to what was going on in games at the time. I think the thing that's interesting about it to me is that there's a connection with Warhammer that we can get to, but also it's not like entirely unique. There are a couple of other games that sort of set out to do similar things, and what they're doing specifically is making a critique of the kind of behavior that Dungeons and Dragons encourages in player characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we should get into it later, but it's very similar to a previous game by Greg as well, called Power Kill. I don't know if you've come across that.
I've come across Power Kill in conversation with Puppetland, but I'm familiar with Puppetland a bit and not at all with Power Kill.
I mean, it's kind of a similar kind of deal. It's in the way that it's being published as violence, and that it's just on the internet. I don't know if I think it was published in like a magazine at some point in the past, but it's all online now. It's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah. So what violence is doing specifically is it's saying the only thing that makes player behavior in Dungeons and Dragons, and so Dungeons and Dragons, if people aren't familiar with the kind of thing that happens in the course of a game. The structure is very much set up around the idea that there will be a problem that the player characters need to solve. They will probably need to solve it through the use of violence. It's very much... Tim Denay talked about how it uses kind of like a Western structure, like, you know, Senor Bandits have raided our village. Like, it is very much kind of that, you know, there's a den of monsters outside town, go and sort it out. And then you go and fight the monsters and you come back with stuff and experience. And the point that violence is trying to make is that that's only acceptable if you situate it in a fantasy world, and you do some sort of mental gymnastics to make it so that the sentient creatures you're killing are like worthy of that kind of treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of calling out that disconnect that like these creatures are explicitly sentient in the text, but the text has decided that they are evil and therefore worthy of violence, maiming, and like killing, right? And like one of the things violence does is it makes its enemies like kind of people who are undervalued by the state, I guess. You know, like homeless people, poor people, minorities, stuff like that, right? And I guess the equivalent there is a state or higher power is labeling a group of people or creatures as, you know, worthy of violence, and you're just kind of enacting that without questioning it, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I guess, you know, where I think it's interesting is that say around about the same time as this, or a wee bit before, White Wolf published a thing called HOL, which is an acronym for Human Occupied Landfill, or possibly His Other Leg. They go through a bunch of things that it could be an acronym for. But the idea in that game very much is similarly that it's supposed to be like a satire of tropes in tabletop role-playing games. And along with HOL, they published a thing called Freebase, which was like a little paper insert in HOL where they suggested that you go out into the world and play the ultimate role-playing game in search of XPs, which are found in other people's wallets. And you get by engaging in combat, which you do by walking up to someone, hitting them, and then telling them it's their turn.
Yeah, it's very similar to, I think there's a bit of violence it's about experience or skill points or something. And it's like, yeah, you get an extra skill point if you give your DM $1, and you get 10 points of experience if you send Hogshead $10.
Yeah. It's interesting because it was clearly like, it's not just this guy, right? It's part of the general milieu is that there's, around about this time, is that there's something kind of sick and wrong in role-playing, and I don't know, like, violence feels like a bit of an inarticulate way to deal with it, as does HOL and Freebase. Like, those are similarly, there's scathing critiques, but they're not very articulate critiques.
Yeah, and like, I don't know if I'm like the most knowledgeable person about this, right? Because I'm just a white guy from Auckland, but I think a lot of the stuff that was missing from those critiques is that a lot of the tropes in games like D&D are very colonial, right? They reek of colonial stereotypes and like the kind of excuses that people at that time used to commit violence against other people. So I wonder, like, if part of the inarticulateness was that, like, RPGs have historically not been the most diverse crowd, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely part of it, and I think also it's like it's sort of feeling its way towards things like the Powered by the Apocalypse revolution. In that it's trying to say, like, this is a bad way to do games, or this is a way to do games that says bad things about us, but it's not really offering any other alternatives yet. And I mean, the rest of Hogshead's output kind of does, because, you know, Nobilis is a very strange game that does lots of things, but not really violence per se. Well, depending on how you define violence, but like very weird existential violence.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like, I think it's kind of in a similar vein to people kind of point this out sometimes, how like a lot of the White Wolf stuff also tried to be a reaction against like the typical modes of play and being like, well, we're not like those other games. We're grown up and we're much more serious. We're not just mindless violence and killing. But they didn't like really provide any real alternative. They're just kind of laughing at it, right?
Yeah, and like I suppose a way that you could see this as a critique of White Wolf is that although I don't know to what extent it's deliberate, I mean one of the critiques of the early White Wolf games in particular is that mechanically they weren't very well thought out. And so they lead to all kinds of perverse outcomes in terms of people building their characters, but also like they try to promote the idea that you should be making a character who's a well-rounded individual. So maybe you should get someone who you're thinking of as like, maybe they're kind of a tough character, but maybe, you know, they also read poetry, so you should give them a point in academics or something. Like, that's kind of the vibe that they're suggesting that you take. But if you actually do that, then you're going to spend a lot of time not being able to do very much.
Yeah. And I hadn't thought about that, but that is true that there's like a lot of White Wolf kind of satire going on. Like with the skills and violence, like one of them is basketball, and it's like, well, when's that ever going to come up? But there's also quite a lot of scathing kind of criticism of splat books and having different smaller books for everything instead of keeping everything in the main package.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That was something that I wanted to talk about, because one of the better jokes in the game, in my opinion, is that every time he talks about something that you're going to need, he specifies that you ought to use like the violence version of that. So you shouldn't print or photocopy character sheets. You should buy packs of them, which will cost you an enormous amount of money. You should use specific violence branded pens and pencils and dice. He doesn't go quite as far as suggesting violence brand paper, but he does list like an enormous amount of like merch ephemera that I don't think any of it existed, but he's, you know, trying to pitch you on buying as many useless things as you possibly can.
Yeah, and there's even a few sections where after he's done listing all those things, he has a little statement like, you know, we're not going to make that, right, you idiot. Like, that's not real.
Well, so that's one of the things that's like that I'm not sure works, right? I'm really interested in what he's trying to do, but also the tone of scorn that he presents also kind of betrays some assumptions, which I think it's like you're kind of doing the thing while critiquing it. So, like, he talks about choosing a gender for your character, and it goes into this digression about, like, Christ almighty, why do you want to do this if you're a female player? But, you know, he's kind of doing the thing that he's critiquing at the same time.
Yeah, and I think he gets away with it in some other places, in just the fact that, and I don't think we've touched on this too much yet, that the game is maybe unplayable. Like, it's just badly designed. And from someone who, worked in the industry for as long as Greg did, like, it seems hard to not think that that was intentional. There's almost a hint of desperation to it all, with him going like, please don't actually play this though. Like, he's afraid that someone's going to take it the wrong way,
Yeah. That's interesting because again, like that was one of the things that I'm not certain lands in the sense that like I can see making all of the mechanics broken as like a critique of the massive screed of what were called like fantasy heartbreakers, where everyone felt like they had to have their own enormously complex bespoke system for everything, and a lot of them didn't work very well, or the white wolf thing of being enormously superior and condescending about your game and having it not work very well. But he can't quite help himself to go and put all of that stuff in. Like, I guess what I'm saying is I feel like if someone tried to create violence now, probably what they would do is not even include a mechanical system. Like they would just have the angry rant and the entire process of trying to put in the mechanics kind of undercuts what he's doing a little bit.
Yeah, I can kind of see that perspective. I think the mechanics that he does include serve as like, they get a chuckle out of me every now and then. But I think there's like almost another layer of the joke where I can imagine, like, even when I was looking up the system again, I saw like a Reddit thread on it, and someone was like, yeah, this looks awesome, I'm actually going to play this now. And there's kind of an added joke of someone trying to and then like not getting very far and giving up. I don't know, it's weird. I think it almost falls into, have you ever come across the term anti-art?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a very good category to put this in. Is like it's deliberately being off-putting, but I think it is telling, right, that you can come across someone on Reddit going, actually, this looks cool.
Yeah, and I don't even, like, I think with a game like this, I don't even know how you'd avoid that without, giving it all away. I mean, you could include a bit at the start saying, please don't actually play this. And it kind of does, but I think I don't know.
I mean, it's the satire paradox, right? Like, any sufficiently advanced satire is going to be indistinguishable to someone from the thing that it's trying to satirize.
Yeah, and I guess there's kind of, I don't know where people stand on it these days, but at least at the time, I think there was a bit of concern as to like, could role-playing games cause people to be like worse? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think anyone's going to go out and commit a mass shooting after playing violence, but maybe it, like, I don't know, affects you in some kind of subconscious way, right?
Yeah, I mean, people have been anxious to look at any currently fringe hobby and blame it for people doing awful things. That's sort of the hangover of the satanic panic stuff around role-playing, isn't it?
Yeah, and like, there's kind of, I'm in two minds about it, because obviously there's like the bullshit from the 80s where it's like, there's, glad we're after the 9 o'clock radio or whatever it is. But there's obviously the satanic panic stuff where there's a lot of people making some really silly comments like, oh, don't, turn your kid satanic. But also, I mean, it seems, at least to some degree, that media like this can have some kind of subconscious effect on the way we view things. Like, if you look at the U.S. military's ongoing funding for like Call of Duty, right? Like they put like millions into that series every year to put a good word in for the U.S. military. They obviously think there's some kind of benefit to doing that. I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. Like, I think that, well, I was going to say, I don't think the US military would do it if it didn't work, but also the US military has a fantastic track record of spending enormous amounts of money on stuff that doesn't work. So I don't know how much I can trust that. But I don't know how old you are. I just turned 42 myself, so I'm kind of like the tail end of the really big wave of White Wolf was my first big entry into role-playing, like, seriously. And there were definitely people who were... And I think they had other stuff going on, or it wouldn't have been possible for this to happen. But I definitely knew people who were, like, psychically harmed by White Wolf.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? It sounds interesting.
Well, I mean, they got very involved and concerned with the whole meta plot and cosmology of the World of Darkness, to a point where it started having quite seriously bad effects on their day-to-day life. And they started having, like, bad relationships between their own mental health struggles and things like the Malkavian clan in Vampire the Masquerade, which is the clan of vampires who all go mad when they become vampires. Like, there was something about, and I guess it's partly the dopamine addictive thing about splat books that he's taking aim at here, but something about the way that world was and the way that it was parceled out made it very compulsive for some people who were susceptible to that, and it seemed like in my 20s when I knew them, like it was doing them quite a lot of harm.
Yeah, and it's really kind of like, I think with the audience for tabletop games then, and probably now to some extent, you're probably going to have, I would say, probably a wider, how do you say it, like you'd probably have a larger number of people who are I'm losing the wording right now, but like people who are maybe like a little more socially outcasted are more likely to be like queer or dealing with like mental health stuff, since it is kind of a bit of a fringe hobby, right? And I wonder how much of it could be those factors on top of like World of Darkness specifically, the addictiveness of splat books, how deep that lore goes. And like how much of each element is contributing to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's like it was at the time. It still is somewhat, but even more so then. It was a fringy hobby that attracted fringy people, and then giving them something like Mage the Awakening, which is like, if you think hard enough, you can warp reality. At the same time that they're having a very hard time with their own reality and probably doing some things to make it squishy around the edges. That could, yeah, absolutely.
And there's also like, I think, a generational disconnect, because like full disclosure, I'm about half your age. So I grew up in like the 5e, 4e kind of generation, and that was my early exposure. White Wolf was mostly dead by the time I had gone into games, or at least the White Wolf, that we knew back then. Chronicles of Darkness, stuff like that, right? Yeah, and just I think the scene back then and the scene now seem to be like really, really different from everything I've heard about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I think that's a really good kind of next direction to go in. And we will talk about that in just a second, but we are around about at the halfway point, which means here on Manawatu People's Radio, we do need to take a brief break for station messages, and we will do that right now and be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast about great trash, problematic faves, and difficult art. I am talking to Sean about the game Violence, the RPG of egregious and repulsive bloodshed. If you are listening on the radio and only came in halfway through, go and listen to the podcast. You get to listen to it from the start, honestly. However, what Violence is a sort of a satire of the way in which role-playing games, at least at the time that it was written, I think it was first published in 1999, get player characters to behave. And you were just talking about, like, differences between the world in which Violence was written, which is very much the world that I started playing role-playing games in, and the like 4th edition, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons world, which is where you got your start. And I think you're right. I think the thing about, like, later versions of Dungeons and Dragons is that I do think that they're much more, how would you put it? Like,
sanitized.
Yeah, they're a lot more sanitized, and they're also, like, more self-consciously or self-aware about their gaminess. And so, like, there's less of a visceral connection to the violence, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's sort of hand-waved away in some aspects, right? Like, if you look at a 5e book or whatever, you're not going to see a explicit portrayal of someone getting their head cleaved in or whatever, right? They're very PG.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the other property that sort of goes back into sort of satire from the 80s that's persisted till now is Warhammer, which has done exactly the opposite thing.
Oh god, you could get really. Have you done an episode on Warhammer?
No, I never got into wargaming, but I really should find someone who did and talk to them about Warhammer, because, like, I think people have written essays about it that pretty much get it right, which is Warhammer wasn't so much trying to do satire as it was ripping off 2000 AD, which was doing satire, and then as it's progressed, it's stripped out more and more and more of the 2000 AD-ness and just kept the kind of, like, iconography.
Yeah, and that's had some pretty, I don't know, at least in my opinion, some pretty disastrous consequences for its kind of player base. But
oh, absolutely. Like, it's probably the gaming scene with the biggest Nazi problem. I at least in terms of tabletop games.
Yeah, it turns out if you make if you portray all of your like main hero faction in very similar to fascist propaganda, you'll attract some fascists.
Yeah. No, if you make them look really awesome and also in universe they are correct, then real fascists will be big fans.
Yeah.
So I guess the other thing that's happened since the writing of this game is that it has become much easier to get published doing other kinds of games. So I've talked before on previous episodes about Wander Home, which is a game that has, like, a really interesting relationship with violence, in that violence is not a thing you do in the game. except for one person who can only do that once and then can never do anything again if they choose to do it. But it's like explicitly part of the history in a really interesting way. And there are other games which are much more about like journal your experience with running the place that ghosts come immediately before they go on to whatever's next. Or like, you know, there's this enormous diversity of stuff, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, 100%. And there's kind of 2 points there. I mean, one is on the publishing end. You don't need a publisher anymore. You can be your own publisher, or you can just throw it up online. Like, there's no need for a big fancy game publisher to print your book. And on the other end, I think if violence came out today, not only would it be seen as like quite offensive, because there is some really nasty stuff in there that like kind of goes beyond what it needs to.
I mean, also, for one thing, like while we're talking about reservations, if you do decide to go and look this up so you know what we're talking about, do be aware that it has like a really cavalier attitude to discussing sexual violence. It's not that it says that it's good, it just like it assumes that if you go out, well, it assumes that if you're talking about awful things that people do to other people, then rape is just part of the conversation, and there's no real like consideration about that.
There are also several hard slurs dropped at multiple points in the book, so a bit of a content warning there.
Yeah. I mean, it's in the context of like talking about the way that racist people talk, but it is in. Oh no, actually, I think in the conversation about like stray bullets, it's just in there. Yeah, no, that's rough. That's real rough.
But where I was going is like, I think if it came out today, even apart from those things, it would be kind of trite. Like people would be like, yeah, there is violence. Like, wow, what an observation. Fantasy adventurers are mass shooters. That's really crazy, man. Anyway, like, it wouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. Like it is been superseded by like a lot of the conversations that have happened in the years after its release. Yeah,
and especially with, I think, what I'd call it like its sister game, Power Kill. If you haven't read Power Kill, it's not very long, but basically the premise is you stop your regular fantasy adventure campaign, and the idea is you talk to the players and you say, actually, you've all been schizophrenic people, and you've just thought that you are fantasy adventurers, but really you've been doing a mass killing. How does that make you feel? And it's like, I don't know, maybe at the time that was like really revolutionary, but it's just kind of a bit nothing these days, right?
Yeah, well, both nothing and like
offensive.
The great 90s, let's just use mental health as like whatever we want it to be, get out of jail free card gambit. That is rough. I did actually want to talk about the stray bullets thing though, because I thought that was, firstly, I think I had mentally misattributed that, or possibly somebody else stole it and reused it. There was another one of these like deliberately edgy and unpleasant on purpose games called Kill Puppies for Satan.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly what you think it is. I don't know that it actually goes into killing puppies, but the idea is that you are a person who does awful things in order to impress demons. But they borrow the idea of stray bullets, which is specifically just saying every time someone shoots a bullet, think about where that bullet goes. If it doesn't hit what they intend it to hit, think about what it hits instead. And it's interesting to me because like that's a surprisingly thoughtful bit of game design inside what is like the rest of the time quite deliberately self-consciously like vapid and awful.
Yeah, and it's like I think it's something that probably still has space to be explored today, right? Like a lot of these games almost assume that the characters are like a SWAT team and they just go through, they never miss, or if they do, it's not a big deal. Um, but like I don't know, in real life, if violence breaks out, there's always a chance that things go really, really horribly.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, there are some games in areas like the Powered by the Apocalypse staple. I'm pretty sure I've come across fail states where it's like something unintended happens as a result of you doing this. And so like that philosophy has carried through.
Yeah, I mean, even the other day, I saw like a friend of mine was designing a system where like every time you get in a fist fight, there is a chance that you just might kill someone because of an experience they had where someone almost died because a fight went wrong, right? And that's like a really kind of powerful, horrible thing that you could explore in a role-playing game. It's fucked up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I think, and I think there is space, right, to say that fictional violence is not real violence, and that's why fictional violence can be fun. And there are game design reasons to do with the DNA of Dungeons and Dragons in particular that mean that violence in the way that Dungeons and Dragons does it is a really easy thing to track in a way that some other kinds of interaction aren't. Like, I think what I'm saying is essentially, like, I think it's okay to like action movies or to go, you know what, guys, we're going to play a dungeon crawl. Like, I think it is okay to do that some of the time if you're aware that that's what you're doing. But similarly, like, I think people who haven't been around it do forget that real violence is very, very different from fictional violence.
Yeah, and it's like stories need conflicts, and to be honest, in role-playing games, most social conflict systems are often kind of bad. It seems that like violent conflict resolution is one of the few ones that we've been able to like nail down as fun.
Yeah, I mean, because it's very easy to gamify that as like number go down, and when it hit 0, you dead. Like that's if you abstract it in that way, that's a very easy thing to do.
Yeah, and it has the same kind of like feedback that I don't know sports does, right? Like if you get in a good debate with someone, it's kind of hard to feel the impact of each sentence or whatever, unless you're like actually doing that. But with stuff like violence and movies and games and tabletop games, there's like real cause and effect that leads to a lot of, I don't know, there's meat there, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And people have told stories about, the guy who went and fought a giant or whatever it is since they've been telling stories. I guess the trick is they've also been telling stories about the other guy who went and tricked the giant, or made friends with the guy over there. I'm not entirely sure where I've ended up. I guess it was. I guess I was interested in finding that oddly thoughtful bit of game design in this thing, and I guess it's just this guy kind of couldn't help himself.
Yeah, and like if you look at his wider body of work, it's clear that Greg really cares about like role-playing games evolving as a medium. Like Paranoia is pretty ahead of its time. Toon is there's no real like violence in that game. It's all slapstick, and that would have been kind of unconventional for the time, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they explicitly say that it's a long time since I played or looked at Toon, but my memory of it is that all that can happen to you as a result of violence is that you have to lie down for a bit and then you get up with a comically large bump on your head. So we are coming up on kind of the end of our time. Do you have other things? Like, are there other things from this milieu of like 90s reaction that you think would be interesting to read? Are there other things that you think do the kind of critique that violence is doing, but do it better?
I don't know if there's stuff that does it better. I think violence does fit into a larger canon of similar media trying to do similar things, though. The number one equivalent I would draw is to the game Manhunt by Rockstar, which is a video game, but kind of works along similar lines in that it is hyper-violent, hyper-nihilistic, but it's trying, and maybe not successfully, to say something about violence itself.
Yeah, now, this is me running into trouble because I never actually played it, but my understanding is that the first of the Postal games was doing a similar thing as well. Like it had all of the kind of directionless violence that the franchise has become associated with, but it specifically had the point that by acting out in this way, you just kind of eventually end up with a pointless death.
Yeah. And I think you could make a whole kind of genre or category out of these games. There seems to be very similar traits in that they're very nihilistic, they're hyper-violent, they're grotesque and difficult to play and look at. I think some people have described them as rotten games, was the classification I've heard. I don't know. I think you could do a lot with that kind of concept, looking into it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point where I must come clean. I made one of these things myself.
Oh no!
it has a small degree of notoriety on the internet. It's called Normality, and it was co-written with a friend of mine. You can find it on Itch if you want. I've re-uploaded it there because people asked me to, basically. And that one has the added feature of being completely incoherent on every level. It was hand-typed and then viciously edited with like permanent markers, and then photocopied on my Works scanner to turn it into a PDF.
Oh my! I'm looking at this now. Jesus Christ! This is some dedication. I'm really into this, actually.
Well, feel free to download that and just beware that it was intended to hurt people. Do you think, because this is a problem that I have with having done this myself as well, because the motivation there was that we were two young men who were too clever by half, and we were essentially annoyed that nobody was taking things as seriously as we were. And we set out to hurt some reasonably specific people's feelings, and ended up making something that, when we looked back at it, was kind of more profound than we had intended it to be in some ways. But I feel like Hull and this have a certain amount of that motivation of like someone who is a bit too clever and feels like their cleverness is not appreciated, and has put all of this effort into making something that is kind of on some level for hurting people. Like, is there value there? Aside from documenting there was this wave of people doing this thing?
Honestly, this is one of my biggest hardline art stances. I will never back down from this. I think even when it is incredibly, it's stupid and abrasive and kind of offensive, I think stuff like this is really kind of important, right? Even if it misses the mark. I think good art is often kind of difficult to parse. I think like you never change your feelings or ideas by choice, right? Sometimes it'll kind of take something that is difficult or hurtful to read to do so. I think we're kind of in an era where a lot of tabletop games are very sanitized, and for good reason, right? They have big art budgets, they have a lot of people working behind them. But I think sometimes that leads us into places where we are not kind of innovating in the way that we could be. I don't know if we should be innovating in the direction that some of these games are doing, but I kind of do miss this kind of, I don't know, sort of edgy boundary pushing stuff, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, look, I will take that. I do. Yeah. I think there is something that is almost innocent. That feels kind of like the wrong word, but like there's something about 90s edge that I do find very interesting because of the way in which it seems like the targets that it picks on purpose are worthy, and coincidentally, because it's often thoughtless, it hits a lot of stuff that it shouldn't. But like, it's kind of like the early South Park thing, you know? Yeah,
and I think in many ways it's a little harder to do today just due to social media. Because like, if I make a game, like, I don't know who's a big publisher right now. Like if I made a game that like explicitly makes fun of and calls out Chaosium, for example, someone working at Chaosium could like make a tweet about me and get like a bunch of people to come and like, I don't know, attack me or threaten me or whatever. But I think like big publishers like Violence is doing should be called out or like made fun of when they are doing stuff that is bad or not cool. I'm glad we're over splatbook culture. I think that was a really, really dumb way of doing things.
Oh yeah, it was absolutely tabletop role-playing trying to copy the worst traits of wargaming and collectible cards. In my view, they looked at the racket that Warhammer had going and went, we should be doing that.
Yeah, we don't need microtransactions in tabletop games. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, look, it has been a lot of fun talking about this strange and unpleasant game with you, Sean. Now,
thank you.
Like, plug your shit. What things do you have that people could like stick in their heads and have fun with?
Well, I make games myself. I have I don't know what you call it. Like, it's not a company. I go by S. Murphy Games on the internet. I make games, I make adventures. I've got a game coming out Friday called Strange Squad.
Hooray!
Which I've worked on for years, and it's finally out, and I'm so happy about it. And that's kind of like it's very Hellboy, paranormal investigation, that sort of thing. So if you're into that, maybe give that a Google.
Excellent. That sounds like a wonderful idea. Well, thank you once again for talking.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've never been on a podcast before.
Ah, well, now you have.
Yippee!
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.